Okay, it's 7:05, so let's get started. Welcome to our webinar, everyone. It's called From Pledge to Policy, Pushing for Change in this New Parliament. And the reason we're holding this webinar is because we're all trying to figure out what to make of the new political reality here in Canada. So I'll start off by introducing myself. My name is Saeed Naguib. I'm the national organizer at the CJPME, and I'm also a local activist for Palestine here in Vancouver. So before we get going with the panel discussion, I want to take a few minutes to take a step back and look at the big picture, because it is easy to forget how much and how quickly the world has changed since October 2023 when it comes to Palestine. And there's this famous quote that says, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. And I think that idea is true for nearly every single week that has passed since October 7th. But despite the fact that the situation is changing incredibly quickly and that we're seeing historic shifts in the way that the world, in particular the Western world, relates to Palestine, the genocide continues, and it is easy to fall into despair. It's easy to doom scroll through the endless images and videos of unbelievable suffering, and it's easy to feel powerless and like our efforts aren't making a difference. I can say that from firsthand experience. And I think the best way to combat that despair and paralysis is to do exactly what we're doing here today, which is to come together, talk about the situation, and identify what is in our control, which levers are within our reach, and how can we take effective action to pull those levers to change Canada's policy as it relates to Palestine. There's a quote from Noam Chomsky that someone shared on a group chat a few months ago that stuck with me and that I think is relevant to what we're doing here today. And the quote is, if you can go to one demonstration and then go home, that's something, but the people in power can live with that. What they can't live with is sustained pressure that keeps building, organizations that keep doing things, people that keep learning lessons from the last time and doing it better the next time. And when I look at the Palestine solidarity movement that has emerged since October 7th, I see a movement that is doing exactly that. For nearly 20 months, we've been sustaining the pressure, building, acting, learning, and improving. And that's also what we're doing here today. We're a few hundred people coming together, learning from each other, and discussing how we can be better advocates for Palestine and for justice. And that matters. The status quo is able to sustain itself when we're apathetic and paralyzed, but it bends and eventually breaks when we keep doing things like this. And we're very lucky today because we get to draw on the insights and experiences of three exceptionally talented and driven advocates for justice, all of whom were part of the recent Vote Palestine campaign. So I'll introduce them very briefly now. Dania Majid is the president of the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association. Rachel Small is the lead organizer in Canada for World Beyond War. And Alex Paterson is the senior director of strategy and parliamentary affairs at the CJPME. The way this webinar is organized is that I'll ask each of our panelists one question about a particular issue that they've been focused on. And then we're going to turn to some general discussion questions. And then we'll reserve the last 20 to 30 minutes for questions from the audience. So please submit your questions through the Q&A function at any time. We'll collect them and save them for the end. So let's get started with our questions for our panelists. Let's start off with Rachel and the Arms Embargo Now campaign. So Rachel, you've been involved with Arms Embargo Now since its very beginning. Can you tell us about the history of the campaign and what kind of progress did the campaign make during the last parliament? And like, what were the challenges that the campaign faced during the last parliament? Where were the blockages? And how do you think the situation is different now with this new parliament?
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for hosting this conversation. Um, so just over a year ago, last May, recognizing that there's already lots of organizing at many different levels, looking at the Canada-Israel arms trade and in general the role Canadian militarism was playing in Israel's genocide, World Beyond War and several allies decided to come together to build the Arms Embargo Now campaign, really as like a coalitional joint effort to unify the efforts of many, many, many different people across the country, which included everything from rail and factory blockades to lobbying and reports and protests every weekend with tens of thousands of people on the streets, really recognizing that how can we unify these calls for Canada to stop arming Israel, and amplify all of our efforts. So that's how the Arms Embargo Now campaign was started. Um, we, I mean, as I'm sure many of you here know, Canada has not fully stopped arming Israel. This struggle absolutely continues. And in fact, just today, I lost track of it and I need to count it later, but over 30 different MPs today received like hand delivered notes to their offices. Some as 100 people showed up at the office to deliver it, some just one or two people at a time. Some received the delivery inside a pizza box. But MPs all across the country today received a mandate letter from their constituents and a briefing note meticulously documenting the ways that Canada is still arming Israel. However, we have achieved a lot together over the past really year and a half. Obviously, recognizing that many people have been organizing in solidarity with Palestine for much, much longer than that. But in the past year and a half, we've fundamentally changed Canada's relationship with Israel. Not enough, baby steps, just a little bit. But I think it's important to recognize that we have made some serious strides forward. So concretely, yeah, I'll share a little bit maybe of what's happened. So, first of all, we have reached a place, I suspect you all have noticed, where the Canadian government is no longer taking it as a given, oh, of course, we're going to keep arming one of our biggest allies in the world. I mean, Canada is a NATO member, has been one of Israel's staunchest allies. We have now moved the Canadian state to a point where it is taken as a given. We have achieved the common sense idea. We've had the moral victory that it is unacceptable for Canada to be arming Israel. And so we've had a position now for the last several months where the Canadian State Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Prime Ministers, are insisting that Canada is no longer arming Israel. We have to get them to follow through, but I do want to take a second to acknowledge this collective partial win. Like we've moved the dial on what is acceptable, and it's no longer acceptable for Canada to be arming Israel. In terms of and that's something that activists around the world have noticed. That's something that other countries have really taken a lot of inspiration from. If the Canadian government can be forced to move in this way, other countries absolutely can as well. In terms of what's actually happened with the Canada-Israel arms trade, the Canadian government paused approving any new permits to export arms to Israel. This happened now just over a year ago. When that pause first started, we sort of thought, well, maybe they're pausing it for a month. Who knows if this is significant at all? But we've recently confirmed that this pause has continued. So that means for over a year now, Canadian companies have not been able to apply for a permit to export military goods that could be weapons, that could be components of bigger machines directly to Israel. This is a win. And when we highlighted that, okay, you've paused approving any new permits, but what about those permits that were already approved from before? 30 of those permits were then canceled, or suspended, I should say. We don't have the full details about that, and a real thing that we're continuing to be missing from the Canadian government is any transparency and public accountability about it. But those are some things that we know they've done. And there's about 100 left of those permits that were approved before the pause a year ago that in theory could still be, and likely are still being used to export weapons directly from Canada to Israel. The problem is there's two other ways that Canada is part of the arms trade with Israel. So that first way was where Canadian companies just export those weapons directly to Israel. We've made a real dent there. We've made that now much harder for them to do. However, a majority of Canadian weapons get to Israel by being sent to the US, where there's essentially no permitting requirements, basically no export controls on Canadian weapons being sent to the US. And it's billions of dollars a year in Canadian military goods that get sent to the US. Most of that stays in the US for the US military, but a large chunk of that gets exported onto other countries, including Israel. So that is a huge focus of the Arms Embargo Now campaign right now. How do we highlight hey, you haven't actually stopped the majority of weapons from going to Israel, and how do we force the government to do so? This looks like everything from shells, mortar cartridges, or mortars, cartridges, like the literal explosives, the propellant fuels that are in the missiles that are blowing up Gazans in their tents, in their homes. Um, and it also includes things like engine parts for F-35s, for Elbit's drones. It includes the military circuit boards that make the regular bombs into smart bombs. Basically, when we're looking at an attack, if you're watching, as I do late at night on your phone, like horrific scenes of violence, there are Canadian components and parts in every scene of violence that you are seeing, and that is still happening. And then finally, Canada's continuing to buy weapons from Israel. When we're demanding an arms embargo, we're demanding what the Canadian government calls an arms embargo, which they have imposed on many other countries in the past, which is that you end the arms trade. So that means you also can't be using Canadian taxpayer dollars to buy weapons from Israel for the Canadian military. That's putting our money directly in the hands of Elbit, of Rafael, of Israeli aerospace industries, of many companies that are literally owned by the Israeli government. We're funding their war effort if we're buying their weapons. It's nearly the same thing as us sending them the weapons. So we've achieved a lot, but we've got a long way to go. However, we're not going to kind of wait and see what this new government does. As I mentioned right off the bat, literally just today, many dozens of MPs received a visit from their constituents with the facts on the ground. We're giving those new MPs the benefit of the doubt that they may not have the full information about the arms trade because the Canadian government has been saying over and over again, oh, yeah, we're not arming Israel. So, in case they don't know, we're bringing that information right to their door. And this is an action that's continuing throughout the month of June. So, I would encourage everyone, if you haven't yet, to go to armsembargonow.ca and join in and deliver this letter to your MP as well.
Before we get Alex's and Dania's input and follow-up, I just wanted to remind the audience that we have this Q&A feature. So if at any point that you have some questions based on what someone said, please feel free to put the question in the Q&A chat, and we'll save it for the end. Alex, I'm wondering, in terms of transparency, the transparency and accountability that Rachel mentioned, which ministries should we try and put pressure on to get that transparency and accountability?
Yeah, so in the first order, it's Global Affairs Canada. They're the ones that manages the permit system, but also you can ask for transparency from Department of National Defense and the Procurement Department as well, because all three of those departments and the ministers associated with them will be involved in big purchases. And we now also have the Secretary of State for Defense Procurement, who will be another interlocutor that we can hold accountable for their decisions related to Israeli arms and tech.
And Rachel, I had a follow-up question on something you said. We're delivering all this information to MPs, and I noticed during the campaign ahead of this election, there were a lot of MPs who just seemed sincerely uninformed. Like we would press them on an arms embargo, and they'd be like, "We have an arms embargo. No Canadian weapons are getting to Israel in any way." And then we'd mention the U.S. loophole, and then there would just be silence. So what is the response that the government is giving when activists, when advocates do mention the U.S. loophole?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it is hard for our movements to. I think we have to put 20 times in as much work to undo the misinformation from one statement that Melanesia Lee would make to the media, or one thing Carney would say offhand. He would sort of offhand say something like, "Oh yeah, that's why we're not arming Israel," and then we have to put in hundreds of hours of work to lay out the truth to the media, to the public. So we have to really not just fact check, but make sure that everyone who heard the first thing that they happened to say kind of off the cuff also hears In fact, that's not true. In fact, all you've done is paused approving any new permits. You have not stopped the many, many, many hundreds of millions of dollars of exports to Israel that you're first conveniently sending to the US, and then kind of blocking your eyes, clocking your ears, and not paying attention to where it goes from there. And frankly, different MPs have been saying completely different things in response. The former defense minister, Bill Blair, I don't know how best diplomatically to say it. It seemed like he said anything that came to his mind in response to questions about the Canada-Israel arms trade that were not backed up by fact, and frankly, were not backed up by Global Affairs Canada statements or by what the Foreign Affairs Minister or the Prime Minister was saying. And he was the Defense Minister. So it's been a really confusing situation of many different MPs, including cabinet ministers, spouting misinformation, wishful thinking, and frankly, with no understanding of the Canada-Israel arms trade, or frankly, of Canada's foreign policy with Israel and with the world. It's been a real problem. I do think having new MPs in office is a huge opportunity for us to provide them that factual information that is backed up by the facts on the ground, and frankly is backed up by the data that's been published on the Global Affairs Canada website. And related to that, one thing I should just say is that a really excellent new report just came out in the Maple by Alex Kosh that in fact showed that the Canadian Commercial Corporation, which is a Canadian government entity that brokers deals between Canadian businesses and foreign customers, did their own internal human rights report. Again, an internal document, and the version Alex got and reported on was 99% redacted. But what we could see of that report is that they themselves have been doing some intense digging into the question of what do we do about the fact that these Canadian weapons are getting to Israel via the US. So the government absolutely knows. Those involved in brokering these weapons deal knows. Do the average MP know the truth? Absolutely not. And I think that's where we can really jump in.
I think there's a germane question here, directly related to the deliveries here that I think maybe Rachel, you're the best placed person to answer. And this is a good one because this happens a lot of the time. And sorry for cutting you off, Saeed. Any suggestions for an MP whose office is still not open and whose phone is still going to voicemail? We have mailed and emailed them a letter. I think, lots of people are going to encounter situations where it's hard to deliver these things to MPs. What I know is there's about a third of MPs who just don't have their offices yet, especially the new MPs who weren't necessarily prepared. So there's an element of just sitting tight, continuing the call, and as soon as they actually have office hours and going. But if Rachel, you have any other suggestions for people who are experiencing difficulties in making the delivery?
Yeah, on the people who haven't yet set up their office, I think that provides you with a perfect opportunity to show up and welcome them to the neighborhood the second they do open their office. And I do mean welcome them. I mean, I think with some of these new MPs, I'm not talking about ones who have been sort of aggressively racist, let's say, or who have taken a very strong anti-Palestinian stance. But for most of the MPs, I think we should try to, for our initial approach to them, really be open-minded that they may, in fact, become an advocate for an arms embargo. And we have had many MPs sign on to the arms embargo now demand and come on side. So I think you can be the first one at their new office to welcome them and bring this information to them. And then I'm also seeing a question in the chat, an excellent question about what can you do when you know that your MP is an ardent Zionist. I think we have to understand we're not going to move every MP. The reason that we've been asking and encouraging folks to still deliver the mandate letter and briefing note to their MPs, even if they don't feel that there's any chance of moving them, is that it's also important. For example, any MP who has received this information can never later say that they did not know that Canada was continuing to arm Israel at this point in the genocide. This is important for a number of reasons, but frankly, it's also important for legal reasons. We have friends right now who are with Claire, who are suing the Canadian government for not following its own export laws around Canadian weapons, and others pursuing other legal challenges. It is relevant if we can document on this day this MP, this of course is especially relevant for cabinet members, but for any MP, on this day, this MP in fact received this information at their office. They have no plausible deniability that they didn't know later.
Are there any other points about the Arms Embargo Now campaign that we want to touch on at the moment? If not, I think we can switch gears from Arms Embargo Now and talk about anti-Palestinian racism. So this question's for you, Dania, and it's the same set of questions. When it comes to APR, what kind of progress do you think the movement made during the last parliament? What were the challenges that we faced when it came to APR? Where were the blockages coming from? And how do you think the situation might be different with this new parliament?
Yeah, well, I think Rachel set the ground out really well in terms of where we are with the new government. So I'll just, work backwards and then sort of get to where we are today. For those who may not have seen, back in 2022, the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association released a framework report on anti-Palestinian racism. And this was a culmination of decades of shared lived experience and years of global consultation around this framework. And since its release, it's been used by from anywhere from students to UN officials. So really, at the end of the day, the real progress on APR, with the short form for anti-Palestinian racism, has come from the people itself. And they have been the ones who've taken the framework report and challenged, institutions across the board, from public schools to universities to the government, the media, and, used an anti-racism lens to call out whatever the exception is to Palestine, or the erasure or the smears or the cancellation that Palestinians and their allies have experienced. And they've done so in such a way that the recognition of APR now is so widespread. And that's even despite all the whining, smearing attacks from the other side in relation to our framework. So the collective lived experience that we have experienced can't be ignored, and we have seen it skyrocket after October 2023. In crafting this report, the report was never truly intended for those external to our communities, but it was actually aimed at the Arab, Palestinian, and allied communities. It was drafted for us. It was so we can name and validate our experiences and provide us with a tool to protect us from the relentless attacks against, either those who identify as Palestinian or those who stand up for Palestinian rights. And in doing so, hopefully empower us to do that work with an understanding of why we are facing the attacks. And we are attacked. Anti-Palestinian racism happens in order to uphold and protect settler colonialism, apartheid, and genocide against Palestinians. So that's how we have measured the success. But there have been some, if you want, government or official government type successes that we could talk about. First, or, in sort of order that it happened. But we did have Justin Trudeau in conversation with Amira El-Rawabi, Canada's Islamophobia envoy. In the conversation with her, there was a readout where he recognized anti-Palestinian racism, committed to doing something about it, which obviously hasn't happened. We saw that anti-Palestinian racism was then included in her government-approved Islamophobia handbook. The Canadian anti-racism report, or strategy, CARS, it references in 3 places that Palestinians in Canada are facing unprecedented levels of hate. I would argue a long way to say anti-Palestinian racism. Minister Kara, before the election, had sent the Prime Minister's office a letter recommending that Canada recognize anti-Palestinian racism. The letter wasn't public, and from my understanding, she never received a response from the PMO's office before Justin Trudeau stepped down. Before that, in the interim, there was an anti-Palestinian racism roundtable hosted by 2 Liberal MPs, which essentially, gathered the experiences of Palestinians and their experiences of anti-Palestinian racism, and the community firmly backed that they supported the ACLA framework. And lastly, we worked on the Vote Palestine pledge. Anti-Palestinian racism, recognition of anti-Palestinian racism was part of the pledge. And now we have a group of elected MPs that endorse that pledge. So those are successes in the government levels. Adjacent, which might be helpful for some people listening, the court in the U of T encampment decision also recognized anti-Palestinian racism, as well as the TMU campus investigation also recognized anti-Palestinian racism as sort of, government adjacent type recognition. So the challenges are that liberals are liberals. So they love to say a lot of something and do absolutely nothing. And so what I will tell you happened in our conversations with the Liberal before the election, we spoke to the Palestinian community, whether, including in Canada and internationally, all the way up to, sort of movement levels, as well as our allies. And we got a very clear direction or directive not to play the definition game with the government or any other institution. So we called for the government to explicitly recognize anti-Palestinian racism in their Canada anti-racism strategy. So not just the experience of unprecedented levels, but actually name it. And only if a definition was required that, the Palestinian and Allied community made it very clear that they wanted the ACLA framework description to be that official definition. What we got was pushback from the government and pro-Israel groups saying they did not want our framework because it included the term Nakba denial. And that was very specific and very clearly articulated to us. And again, because we had consulted with, the international Palestinian community, we went back and said, our framework is not a buffet of lived experiences that the government can pick and choose from. That in and of itself is anti-Palestinian race, and particularly erasing any reference to the Nakba in the middle of a genocide. So, this was what we were contending with. And unfortunately, sometimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And there have been people who have, maybe unwittingly played the definition game and have failed. And the result is they've created problematic definitions that have erased the Nakba and settler colonialism, or engaged in dialogues without Palestinians present, which have set this up as a religious conflict between Muslims and Jews. And of course, that process collapsed and there was no consensus around anti-Palestinian racism. What has happened is these watered down definitions of anti-Palestinian racism that erased Nakba denial from it, as well as settler colonialism and other references, were then used against the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association to try to get us to accept a definition without the word Nakba or the phrase Nakba denial in it. What we've learned from these experiences, and we have warned many others of these experiences, that the process of dialogue is meant to delay, distract, demoralize, demobilize, and ultimately shut down any discussion and anti-Palestinian racism. So we strongly urge allies not to engage these games, especially before any formal recognition of APR has taken place in the process. What we're seeing now and what we're concerned about with the new parliament is that the messaging right now is all around safety. And of course, that does not include Palestinian safety. So we are not happy to see that there's a push from the federal government around bubbles legislation similar to the bylaws happening in different cities, which we know are aimed at shutting down pro-Palestinian protests. And we know, and we will see it happen, it will shut down our other social justice movement protests as well. We anticipate, again, similar delay tactics as the Trudeau government, a lot of conversation with not a lot of action. We are concerned that there are another large group is pushing the government on a definition without there first being recognition or clarity around what definition would be used. We are concerned it could be a watered down version of ours, or that it could be dragging our community into yet reliving another consultation and having to reshare their trauma once again. And I think it's important, lastly, that talking about anti-Palestinian racism or recognizing anti-Palestinian racism, it's not just about putting the term somewhere. It's the actual systemic decisions that have resulted in the manifestation of anti-Palestinian racism that we should be focused on when we talk about anti-Palestinian racism. So, for example, the bubble legislation, the Gaza family reunification debacle, arms shipments, as Rachel identified, we have strict sanctions against other countries around their arms shipment. Why is Palestine the exception? The lack of sanctions on Israel, again, we see them happening in other countries, but again, Palestine is the exception. The media language that's used to manufacture consent for a genocide or for these exceptions to erase Palestinian humanity, essentially to make and normalize the violence against us, such a way that no one really expresses much outrage against it. And ultimately, this all comes down to Canada's complicity in the occupation, apartheid, and genocide of Palestine and the impunity it extends Israel. This is the anti-Palestinian racism we should ultimately be tackling.
There's a lot there to unpack. I'm wondering, in the previous parliament, we did get close. It seemed like there was momentum towards getting the government to recognize anti-Palestinian racism. Do you think there's a chance with this current government to regain that momentum and actually get it across the finish line?
It's to be determined, I think, as best I can say at this point, because the ministry that we were working with no longer is there. The department, Minister Kara's department, I mean, she's gone and that department's no longer there. It's now called Identity and Culture. So we have to, look to see what their priorities are and whether or not we can restart that conversation. We know that and this is what we've heard from others, sort of insiders, so-called insiders, is that the economy and safety is really Carney's priorities right now. So we might have to interject anti-Palestinian racism in those processes, because those processes, look to be setting out to deprive us of our civil rights, our charter rights. Might be, again, looking to implicate the exception or, institute the exception to those rights. So we might not be doing the battle directly, again, with, getting it into cars. The battle might be on other fronts where we see our rights being taken away or the Palestine exception playing out. And the arms embargo example is one such example where, we can impose arms embargoes on many other countries, but when it comes to Palestine, all of a sudden, it becomes a word salad and confusion arises. Again, on the immigration front, now we're going to see it on the, there's sort of this haziness that has come up with the RCMP investigations of Israeli criminals, war criminals on Canadian soil. And this is sort of the trend we've been seeing with the government. They kind of say the right thing at the beginning, and then you sort of poke it, and all of a sudden, a cloud of, a fog sort of envelops what might have been progress. So I agree with Rachel. We have to keep pressing on and putting their feet to the fire and insisting on clarity on what they mean when they say they're going to do one thing or the other. I mean, the other point I want to also emphasize is that we can't take any of the gains that we have achieved for granted, and we have to hold the ground on those gains, because we have seen time and time again in not just the Palestinian movement, but other movements, those gains get whittled down very quickly because the attacks on them never stop.
And what are the attacks that are threatening when it comes to APR right now? Is it through IHRA? Is it through the bubble bylaws? Are there other avenues that the pro-Israel lobby is using?
Yeah, so the attacks, namely come around Nakba and Nakba denial. This is, and this is the term that's really irked, the pro-genocide, pro-Israel lobby. They have really taken exception to us talking about the Nakba. We've seen these attacks play out at public schools, and other institutions where there's any attempt to recognize the Nakba or commemorate the Nakba. And then the attacks happen and those events are shut down very quickly. These rationale, which is really preposterous and easily picked apart is that by talking about the Nakba, we are downplaying the Holocaust. And it should be noted that downplaying the Holocaust is a provision within the criminal code. So, they have created this fear around the Nakba, and the governments are falling into it. And this is sort of a question that has come up several times in our discussion. And, we've spent a lot of time trying to unpack it, but, we're being accused of trying to create a backdoor channel to the Canada's recognition of the Nakba, which is again, another distraction not to talk about the racism. The other piece that we have seen, other institutions, Canada not being the exception, is that you might get recognition. They might say the words, but when it comes to actually decision making, it's as racist as it gets. So, they recognized in cars, for example, or they recognized in Amira Al-Ghawabi's handbook that anti-Palestinian racism exists, or we're experiencing unprecedented levels of hate. But the government, that hasn't stopped the government from creating, policies, decisions, putting out rhetoric that incites hatred towards our communities or entrenches it or into law. So we have to kind of be careful we don't put all our eggs into the recognition basket and forget the actual manifestation of it. And I think it's important that we attack the manifestations where it appears, because this is where the wins have been, we've been garnering on, at grassroots level, is when we're in those spaces and calling it out directly when a decision or policy has been put in place. And that's where the successes have come.
I think we could talk about this for hours, but we have 20 minutes left, so I'm going to switch gears again here. Now towards statehood and settlements. So this question's for Alex. You speak to MPs all the time. Can you tell us what the situation is like when you speak to them, and the attitude that you get from members of parliament when you talk to them about statehood? When you have those conversations, what are they like? What were they like in the previous parliament, and how do you think it's different with this new parliament?
I think this is an interesting thing. I don't usually bring up statehood. That's something that actually MPs like to bring up. Generally speaking, I go in wanting to talk about arms embargo or APR, and in different ways and in different fashion. If I was with an NDP MP, they might bring up statehood near the end of our discussion when we're wrapping up as something to work on, but they kind of very much are comfortable with and grant some of the other areas that we work on. But with liberals, especially their Muslim MPs, statehood is kind of, I think, central to what they feel like they need to deliver for their community. So actually the push for statehood is not coming from us. It's liberal MPs like imploring us to work on statehood, especially now with France saying that it wants to go forward with recognition at the conference that it's co-hosting and trying to get the UK in. It's no coincidence that Anita Anand is actually flying to France and the UK this week to talk with partners there, that statehood is really on the table. And it's in the next 2 weeks that Canada has probably its best shot ever to recognize the Palestinian state. If France and the UK move forward with recognition, there will never be a better chance for Canada to be there with other countries that has strong cultural ties, like it does with France and the UK. I think there's different opinions in the movement on whether or not statehood is something that we should push for. Not being Palestinian, I try and stay mostly agnostic on that question, but I do think that from a strategic perspective, it does deliver Palestinians more access to international justice, and we can think of it as a stepping stone towards some of the bigger wins, which I think are accountability for the genocide, apartheid, and illegal occupation through Palestinians having protected access to global justice institutions. Maybe before I turn to maybe another topic, I throw it over to Dania, because I know you have things to say about the statehood side.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of captured where the community is. The sort of the fear is that it's, from some people, or the hesitancy is that it's sort of endorsing one outcome over another outcome, or having Canada decide what the outcome is for Palestinians. Uh, but the reason why it went into the Vote Palestine pledge, and why there is a push from some, from a lot of people in the community, and that would be sort of from the diplomatic and legal side of things, is, as you said, it's a stepping stone. It's sort of, really trying to entrench Palestine, um, you know, at this as a state, with benefits that a state has, so they can access, um, make it easier to sort of achieve access to justice at the international level. So it's sort of seen as a strategic step, not, and then that's where the push comes from, as not as a step where Canada decides what kind of state we are. Um, so that's essentially where this, the support is coming from. It's really, as from a strategic point of view, as opposed to a final outcome point of view.
Yeah, I think the one other thing that I grapple with and don't necessarily know how to navigate as an ally is that I do feel sometimes like state recognition is a stand-in for a recognition, like Palestinian and Arab individuals, as a recognition of their humanity. Like they want Canada to recognize it because they're looking for some validation from other people in this country that we recognize you as human. And I feel sometimes like the recognition of the Palestinian state is really caught up in looking for like the validation that this just isn't a racist colonial structure that views me as subhuman. Like we're getting the messages from Israel all the time that that's how they feel about Palestinians, and all of the pro-Israel lobby echoing those sentiments about Palestinians, that it's come down to this is a way to recognize my humanity.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to, the counter to anti-Palestinian racism, right? Where it's the complete erasure of the existence of Palestinians. And one of the biggest smears that we face as Palestinians is that there's no such thing as Palestinians. And this is something we're constantly being, having to push back, like we can't even start the debate as, okay, let's talk about, this is why dialogue is such, I mean, we could have a whole conversation about that, but the starting point essentially is there's no such thing as Palestinians. No, there is such thing as Palestinians. I mean, this is stuff I've dealt with in law school. Um, first year is no such thing as Palestinians is sort of what I walked into. So, this sort of helps address that erasure that we talk about in the anti-Palestinian racism framework from a very fundamental level. Um, the only country, like we were erased from the map, and it's about putting us back on the map and giving us, status to keep pursuing our justice, however it unfolds.
Yeah, I don't think you have to support the two-state solution or that idea to see the value in trying to push Canada to recognize a Palestinian state, because for so long, the two-state solution has been presented as the be-all, end-all to solving, to achieving justice in Palestine. And I think if Canada recognized Palestinian state and Canada saw afterwards that, oh, this doesn't fix anything because Israel has it in law that they will never recognize a Palestinian state, then it'll sort of force our government to see that, oh, this isn't the be all end all of the conflict, and there's the party, the aggressive party here is not Palestine, it is Israel, and it would create this friction between Canada and Israel that would benefit the movement as well. Alex.
And all that is to say is that the next 2 weeks are kind of crucial. Roughly speaking, the UN conference on the two-state solution happens around June 17th. So now is the time that the Liberal caucus needs to hear from people in spades in their own words that the time is now for statehood. I don't know if we'll do an email action on it. What I think matters more at this point is for people to call and personally email their MP in their own words. That there's never going to be a better time for Canada to stand beside its G7 allies and do it now. If France and the UK do it and Canada don't, there will never be those people to stand beside again. This is your shot.
And a bit of a related issue are the settlements. So, Alex, can you talk to us a little bit about that and the push to get Canada to sanction businesses that do business in the occupied territories?
So, it's been a longstanding issue and has kind of had to take a back seat because of what was happening in Raza over the last year and a half. But we are trying to build momentum with partners like IJB and Just Peace Advocates to keep pushing the government to ban settlement trade, ban the sale of properties. So I think there is a way to make significant headway on that. The NDP continues to work on a private members bill to ban settlement trade that I know the Quebec, the Bloc Quebecois supports. And I think there is some momentum amongst Liberal backbenchers. We just really need the NDP to introduce that bill at some point. And then, like individuals can work with the movement to write complaints against specific settlement property transactions that you find out about, against specific companies that are doing illegal business with settlements. Like we have a complaints-based process here in Canada where the bureaucracy doesn't go looking for the problem, but they're kind of forced to address it if it comes to light. So, CJPME will be working with partners to submit complaints this year, but we also are interested in, helping people learn how to submit their own complaints so that this is a movement and grassroots driven process, not something that just, experts and NGOs are relied on to do.
So CJPME will provide resources on how to file those complaints, but off the top of your head, is there a straightforward, broad strokes explanation on how to do that? Is there a website people can go to?
There isn't a website, but I think later in the year we'll be able to host a webinar or a workshop on how to file a complaint and provide some templates with successful complaints. Basically, what it involves is doing internet research on publicly available sources. Sometimes it can involve reading annual reports and looking at people's tax and income disclosures for different corporations and things like that, and taking time to put together a file in a certain format. And that's how you can submit a complaint. So, one of our allies, David Mibaser and Just Peace Advocates, they did that really, I think, forced the government's hand to deregister the Jewish National Fund as a charity through years of filing these complaints that they learned to do themselves. They were able to force the government's hand on the JNF. It's one of the other ways of doing activism other than contacting your MP, and it's about the same level of rigor as writing a briefing note and speaking to an MP about a briefing note, but it's interacting with another part of kind of the government apparatus.
We're almost at the top of the hour here. So I asked the panelists if we could do an extra 15 minutes because there's still there are some questions in the Q&A that we can get to, and there's some general discussion questions. So we'll extend it for an extra 15 minutes, and then we'll just go through some of these questions. So one of them that I saw here in the chat, which is already related to one of the questions I had prepared, is from Lena, and says, now that the NDP caucus, our main ally, is so small, who do we turn to? Almost no Bloc MP endorsed the Vote Palestine platform. Do we have enough of a presence in Quebec? Are there ways to reach out to the pro-Palestine groups in Quebec? Alex, do you want to take this one?
I'll take part of it, but I think other folks can answer. I think so. The Bloc has moved into this direction where they don't sign anything as individuals. They just let their critic speak for the entire party. And before the last election, the Bloc Foreign Affairs critic actually decided not to run again. So there was no foreign affairs critic who could lead the party to sign Vote Palestine. There were a few candidates who did sign on, but the Bloc did write a letter to Jolie when she was foreign affairs minister supporting a two-way arms embargo. They never made that letter public, but they did share it with CJPME and allies. And, you know, when we wrote our report card, we didn't fail the Bloc. We rated them a C. I'm getting my toddler's rating the webinar. I could present with a toddler. So it means that the Bloc is an ally. Sometimes we have to work really hard to bring them in, and we need to like organize and coordinate with our allies in Quebec. One of the things I did after the election was look at you know, like how many people in block ridings are on the CJPME list. And of all the parties, they're the representation that we have the least. So even CJPME has work to do to make inroads in Quebec so that we can have an expectation that the bloc will respond to us. I think sometimes as movements, it's on us to build power such that those MPs will respond to us because we are part of their communities and their constituents.
And there's another related question. So the bloc holds the balance of power, but one of the big differences now with this parliament is that we have 10% of the Liberal caucus, the governing party, that signed on to the Vote Palestine pledge. So we have this inroad into the governing party that we didn't have there before. So this question has to do about that. It's from Tina, and it says there are 25 MPs that have been re-elected that are supportive of the Palestinian cause. What kind of pressure can they exert on Prime Minister Carney in addition to the mandate that is being delivered to them due to the urgency of the situation in Gaza? So the MPs that signed the Vote Palestine pledge, how are we going to work with them to realize those demands? And maybe this question can also just be more broadly, like, what is our attitude towards the Liberal Party? Because with under Trudeau's government, we just felt like, hey, this got Trudeau's Liberals were non-ally. They dug in their heels for Israel, and they're going to fight us every step of the way. With Carney's Liberals, things seem a bit more. We don't know. It's too early to tell. So, how do we approach them now? And Michael has his hand raised.
I'll break this. I was hoping somebody else would. I guess maybe one thing that I could let people know is coming imminently is on the Vote Palestine website on the candidates page. We have taken at the very top of that page, all the candidates that had voted Palestine is loaded up there with their party and their parliamentary contact information. So we want to make it as easy as possible for people to approach those who endorsed and got elected to hold them to account to what they actually pledged. So you know, we want to, and I think that's at the end of the day, they have to feel the pressure. There's a whole list of priorities they're going to have to deal with. We're not the only people putting pressure on them. But we have to make our presence known by, again, being in touch, participating in actions that all the, Rachel's group, Alex, Saeed, all the alerts that they are sending out. And the other groups that were part of the Vote Palestine coalition campaign, everyone's doing that work. And a lot of that work is focused on the government. So if you don't know what to do on your own, like look out for those campaigns, follow the groups doing that work. And when they make a call for action, take the couple of minutes it takes and support that action. And if you can do more, that's great. But at the end of the day, they have to feel that, that pressure from their constituents. And, that includes the MPs who didn't endorse. And we believe, based on our conversations, there are a lot of other Liberal MPs who are supportive, but for whatever reason, didn't make that support public. So don't, you know, as Saeed said, it's 10% that publicly endorsed, but there's probably, at least maybe double that in less vocal support. So I think it's about, the other thing I've learned just having talked to an MP at a different event, they're not informed. Many of them are new. So when I talked to one MP and was like, chastising him on Gaza and the bubble legislation, he had no idea. He had no idea about the arms. He had no idea about the bubble legislation. So I kind of had to pivot a little bit because I got the sense he was interested and supported. I pivoted a bit from attack mode to explanation mode, and took that time to explain to him why Canada's positions on arm embargo and bubble legislation was problematic. And eventually the penny dropped. I don't know what he's going to do with it, but I think starting with a conversation and then working our way up to intensification, might be a good approach for MPs. We are not sure whether they're on side or not on side to test the water. The ones that are on side, we get them to push, and there are things they can do as elected officials who are openly on side.
Alex?
Yeah, so one of the important things to do is to research your MP before meeting with them, see if they've made public statements on Palestine and kind of suss out where they are. And you can tell kind of pretty quickly if they fit into three boxes, which is supportive, against, or somewhere on the fence, or the don't know category. And I think with someone who's against, it's pressure, 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 and organizing in their riding to make a vote threat if they don't support Palestine. With the fence, you give them some time. You inform, you get to know them, you build a relationship until their opinion forms. Then they're either in supportive camp or they're in the opposition camp. Because, after 2 years of being informed, if they're in the inaction camp, that's against. And then with the people who are supportive, it's finding concrete actions that they can take on a consistent basis that moves the campaign along. And for each of the campaigns, you'll notice from our organizations that we will have concrete things that an MP can do that continues to signal to the cabinet that there's support for Palestine and continues to build the pressure on cabinet to change all the decisions that they need to change.
And I'll use this opportunity to plug an initiative that the CJPME will be launching that I've been working on with Alex called the Lobby Corps. So we want to build the CJPME's ability to put pressure on MPs and to empower local activists to do so. So the week after next, we're going to be releasing an email with a registration link. And then the week after that, we're going to do our first orientation for the Lobby Corps. But the idea is that we're going to provide training for activists and advocates who are interested in learning how to best engage with their MPs, how to better engage with their MPs. We're going to be providing training on how to do that and how to target demands to particular MPs. Before I started working at the CJPME, I was meeting regularly with my MP, but I would just go to him and be like, "Stop the genocide!" Like post on Twitter, like post some pictures of what's happening, like bring it to, and he'd just be like, "What? Like what are you? He just didn't know what he was supposed to do, and I didn't really know what to tell him specifically to do. And actually, I started meeting with Alex, and he had this like great spreadsheet where he had each MP's name and then their position, what committees they were sitting on, and had targeted demands for those MPs. And that actually led to inroads with the relationship. So the idea behind the Lobby Corps is to provide that kind of structure, that kind of insider knowledge that makes those conversations much more productive. So that'll be coming soon. Okay, with the time that we have left, I have maybe an easy question to answer. How many pro-Palestine Liberal MPs are there in the current cabinet? We have 17 pro-Palestine Liberal we have 17 Liberal MPs who signed the Vote Palestine pledge, if I remember correctly. but we also have people who are quietly sympathetic behind the scenes. And this is a demand that we can present to Liberal MPs and other MPs, is to join the Canada-Palestine Friendship Group, which is a committee. It's a committee that any MP can join. There's no limit to how many can join, and we know that there are more sympathetic MPs than just the people who signed Vote Palestine, because that committee has like 42 people in it already, and that is a great avenue for cross-partisan action on Palestine. Alex?
Just in terms of the cabinet specifically, I would hazard an inference of 4 or 5 in cabinet specifically. But I think in terms of hard support from the other side, I think there's about the same. It continues to kind of be a battleground. So work to do.
Okay, maybe we can just end it with a general question here for everyone. Is what do you think are the biggest opportunities for policy change within the new parliament? Do you see any low-hanging fruits? And do you see any policy demands that will be particularly difficult? What should our goals be? Maybe we can start with the low-hanging fruit. Alex?
I'm not going to go for the low-hanging fruit, and I'm kind of going to address one of the questions in the chat that also was feeling maybe disheartened with all of the effort that we've put in for what we've gotten. So I really would say I cut my teeth in organizing on a campaign to stop the Energy East pipeline. I would say, as hard as that was, it's less significant than stopping a genocide of an entire nation. And just stopping one pipeline took 5 years of my organizing, plus people who had been at it for 7 years. And I think we're in the case where like concrete steps to Palestinian freedom has been a long time coming. And I know it's felt really, it feels disheartening that we haven't stopped the genocide in a year and a half, but this is something more complicated than stopping a pipeline in terms of the relationships in Canada that allow the type of complicity that we have. So I would actually say, like Rachel outlined, the fact that we have changed the narrative around whether Canada can have like a military trade relationship around Israel in under a year. We changed that, and they've been stuck in this certain narrative where they've been doing all this disinformation for another over half of a year. In under a year, we were able to completely change the narrative about Canada's military relationship with Israel. That is significant, kind of beyond words in my ability to describe it. But now we just need to continue to follow it up and make sure that that narrative starts to live in policy. And this is where it gets really hard, because we have to be focused and strategic and not burn all the movement's energy out on kind of tangents and things like that. So that's why I think, like closing the US loophole for arms is one of the biggest achievable things that we can do, because it's something that Parliament can do by a vote that a lot of the other things are left up to cabinet. So that was one of the problems with the March 18th motion from the NDP, is they were trying to signal like a moral position for a bunch of decisions that had to happen by cabinet, which is not a democratic kind of institution. Whereas we can close the US loophole, I think, through Parliament, which means that every MP, we can bring them a tangible thing that they can do to remove Canadian support for the genocide.
Sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
I was just going to say that I feel like a common theme that's come up this whole evening is like one of the real challenges with a Liberal government, and this Liberal government part 2 or whatever, part 3, anyways, is that they sometimes will start talking the talk, and they sometimes will start saying the right things, and that can be significant in changing the narrative on Israel. It's not nothing, and it is certainly not nothing on the global stage, and it absolutely influences Israel's other allies in the world. But it is really hard to maintain a movement when they start talking as though you have won what you demanded when you have not. So on one hand, I don't think it's true that this government is not movable. I think they are. Um, but I think we've all just got to remain extremely vigilant. Like Dania was saying earlier, like, okay, so maybe they start talking about anti-Palestinian racism, but have they stopped being racist? Have they actually changed the policy? Have they actually changed their actions? And I think every aspect of our struggles are going to have to just look like that constant vigilance. Um, but I also think there's been a year and a half of movement building and practice around that. And I think that the type of movement growth and diversity of movement action that I have seen in the past year and a half, like I've been organizing for a long time and I've been through many, many, many cycles of this. And it's been phenomenal. And I tend to really be a diversity of tactics kind of person. And I do think that what moves the government is everyone pushing in their lane exactly how they can. Like truly, I think it's the people in their church groups who are, yeah, confronting their MP when the MP tries to come to the Easter service at their church, or same thing, the folks who are saying, no, in fact, you cannot celebrate Ramadan with us while you're doing these policies in their faith spaces. I think it's the people who are protesting Thousand Strong every weekend. I have always a soft spot for direct action. I think when we do shut the rails, I think when we do block the highways, I think when we do the weapons factory blockades, they absolutely are paying very close attention and getting frantic calls from the weapons industry and from commercial interests. I think that when they will ignore your phone calls, they will ignore you knocking at their door and act like it doesn't impact them. It absolutely impacts them. And these MPs are feeling the way their constituents are agitating. I think it really takes all of it. And I think that if the movement was going to kind of burn out and crash and stop organizing around it, that would have happened a year ago. I don't actually see that happening. Like I see our strength building. And one last opportunity I see is that this feels like a unique sort of moment to try to tear away Canada's foreign policy from the US's. Also a very difficult moment to do that. But I think there was a moment where a broad swath of the Canadian public understood, like, maybe we actually should not have a joint military policy with the US. Maybe we shouldn't be buying all our weapon systems together. Maybe we shouldn't be buying their fighter jets. Maybe we shouldn't be doing the exact same war making they're doing in the world. I feel like this is a moment for that. And Canada needs to have its own unique foreign policy if it's going to tear itself away from supporting Israel's genocide.
We're truly living in historic times. We're also at time, so we'll wrap up here. There are a few questions that we didn't get to answer. There's some people asking about if they don't have experience lobbying, what to do. If your member of parliament isn't responding, what to do. These are things that we will address directly and practically with the Lobby Corps. So please stay tuned. And then for the other questions that we weren't able to address, please email us afterwards and we will respond. And thanks everybody for attending. Thank you to our panelists. I hope that we can do more of these webinars in the future, but they're only worthwhile because people show up. And so thank you to everyone who showed up today. And we will see a free and liberated Palestine. Okay. Thanks, everyone.